How are you doing? I am so happy to be here with you. I am so happy to be here in this space. First of all, my name is Joyce Ozeh. I am a civil rights attorney living in Chicago, and I am also a disability rights attorney. And I am a mental health advocate with lived experience. And I welcome you to this space where we cultivate your mental wealth. And what we're doing here is we want to go from a place of mental illness to a place of mental wellness, and from mental wellness to a place of mental abundance. Because when you are abundant, you're not only able to feed yourself, you're also able to feed others and move in the overflow. So, before I talk more about the show and what you can expect, I want to hear from the audience. Who is in the space? Who is in the room? Carla, hi from Michigan. You are a fellow Midwest woman. I love it. I grew up in Illinois, so I know the Midwest very well. Janelle, greetings. So happy to have you here with us. Keep commenting where you're watching from, what your name is, but most importantly, this is all about mental wellness in the Black community. What are you curious about when it comes to mental wellness? What are you concerned about? What are your fears? And my favorite is, what are you hoping to be free from? Let this be a journey that we go on together. These are not just sound bites that sound nice and gushy. Like I said, I have lived experience with mental wellness. So I know what it feels like not to be well, and I know what it feels like to move to a space of wellness. So I'd love to do that with you. I want to specify that I am not a mental health professional. I'm bringing a new perspective in that I am someone with lived experience. So, a little bit more about introductions. Like I said, I'm an attorney, a civil rights attorney here in Chicago. I've been practicing for, I want to say, 7 years. That feels like a very long time. But I strongly believe that mental wellness, the Black community, having these conversations, figuring out how to navigate these conversations, and just how to be abundant, y'all, that's my life's work. So I'm really happy to have this space and to cultivate that. A little bit more about me too is that I love cooking. I like eating more than I like cooking, I think, but I love all things culinary. I love plants. I'm going to get into my story in a little bit, but a part of what got me to a place of mental wellness was getting into planting and cultivating a garden, an indoor in-home garden. That really helped me get to a healthy place. And I love living in the city. I grew up in the suburbs, and the suburbs are fine. The suburbs are fine. But nothing beats living in Chicago. I lived in Hyde Park, outside for about 7 years, actually. And now I'm living downtown. So again, tell me where you're listening in from. Tell me what you're hoping to discover and any questions you have. So, why am I here? What is my story? I want to first set the room for what I am hoping this space would be. This is not just a space where I have conversations about mental illness and mental wellness, and I have people on. First and foremost, this is our space. This is our conversation, and this is our room. If there's anything that you want to ask, if there's anything that you are struggling with, if there's anything that you just want to share, let this be our conversation. At any point, you can type something in the comments. I'll be sure to monitor it and share that or encourage you or say me too. But this is our conversation more than anything. So please feel free to pause me, jump in, and dive in. Does that sound good? Okay, let's begin. So, mental wellness. First of all, like I said, I am Nigerian American, which means I was born here. My parents are immigrants, and I identify as Black. And if there's anything that we're coming to understand more and more as Black people, it's that mental illness has been stigmatized for a really long time in our community. I remember growing up hearing stories about how people who are mentally ill are treated in Nigeria, even how it's thought of sometimes as being demonized, how even here, when you say mentally ill or I'm struggling, if you think about Black history, especially in this country, to be able to discover your emotions and your struggles and explore that is a privilege. There are people who have been through in our history far worse than we're experiencing now, and they didn't have the luxury of being depressed or being anxious. My parents did not have the luxury of exploring anxiety and depression. They came to this country and they had to figure out how to survive. How many of you can relate to this idea of, I don't have time to be sick, I have to survive, or depression, get over it. There are things that we have to do. That's kind of the environment that I grew up in. And to be honest, I don't blame culture. I don't blame my parents because, again, when you have either been forcefully taken from another country or you're coming to another country for new opportunities, your emotions are the last thing on your list. You have a family, you have kids, and you need to figure out how to survive, period. So when I'm talking about this, it isn't from a place of blame, but what we have to do when we're figuring out our stories is being honest about our stories. And I can honestly say that I don't know that there is always space in the Black culture or Black community, as diverse as our community is, to explore mental health without feeling like we're being weak or complaining or being soft. Carla, I see you talking about having ups and downs, grieving over loved ones, depression, but don't want to start a medication. Girl, I'm gonna circle back. I'm gonna circle the block because I relate too strongly with this, exactly what you're saying. So I'm going to make sure that I come back to that because that's exactly what I was feeling about not wanting to start a medication, but knowing something was off. And let me tell you, I've been strange my whole life. Thank God, I'm a little bit less strange. I'm a little bit more joyful, but y'all, when I was a child, I never smiled. I was hyper worrisome. My mom is a nurse, and she would come home from work at 2 or 3 a.m., and I would stay up, look out the window almost every night to make sure that I could watch her car come into the driveway because I was so concerned that something was going to happen to her. Or I was an extremely emotional child, and it manifested in like a moodiness, in being very serious and somber all the time. I liked to self-isolate. I read a lot of dark books, as in books about like death or sadness or all of these things. That's what I naturally gravitated towards. I grew up in a Christian home, went to church every single week, but I just had an overwhelming sense of sadness, anxiety, and irritability was the biggest thing. If you would have asked me, were you an anxious kid? I would have been like, I don't know. But I knew that I was easily angered. I was very moody, and I had no idea why. My dad passed away from cancer when I was 13 years old. My mom became a single mom of 4 kids at 42 years old. Now that I'm older, 42 years old is not old at all, and I have no idea how she did it. But the death of my dad brought a lot of instability to my already kind of unstable mental state. I remember I went to school the next day. Carla, you're talking about grieving over loved ones. I never gave myself permission to grieve my dad's death. I wanted to be a good Christian, and thank God, in the good and the bad, I went to school the very next day because I had a math test and I am so bad at math. And my concern was I don't want to have to retake this test. Instead of grieving and focusing on my dad, I found a way to focus on other things. And I never grieved. So what happened is 13 years old, by the time I'm 17, I'm graduating high school, 18, I'm going to college, went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, ILL. Shout out to anyone who is familiar or goes there. I'm walking down campus and I'm crying. And I don't know why I'm crying. I go and I see like a free therapist and I sit across from her. I think the first one was either a white woman or East Asian woman. And to be frank, I just didn't think she could understand me. As in, I didn't think she could relate to what I was saying. And I knew where she was going with all her questions, so I never went back. Fast forward to going to law school, and I was officially diagnosed in law school with generalized anxiety and major depression. The first thing I said to the therapist was, I don't have time to have a mental illness. I don't have time to be sick. Carla, thank you so much, my dear, for your condolences. It was tough, but at the same time, grief makes it easier to relate to people who have grieved. I think it makes you more compassionate, and I don't think I would be who I am without grief. So I appreciate that, and I thank God for just being able to come out the other side of it all. So law school, dealing with the diagnosis, but I do want to pause because I do see a concern. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. So happy to have you in the room and in this space. Thank you for sharing about your daughter and how difficult it is when you're navigating watching someone with mental illness. How do you help them? How do you support them? And I want to take time to make sure that I am understanding what you're saying about, Mary is graciously sharing her own story about her daughter who has self-medicated with marijuana, and it might have been mixed with something that was bad. So first, I see that you said that she hates you and she won't get any help. So much to talk about here. And a part of what's going to happen in our space is this is a space for us. And we're going to talk about relationships as they relate to mental health. As someone who struggled with mental illness, who pushed a lot of my family members away, let me tell you something. Who I was in my brokenness isn't who I am. Who your beautiful daughter is in her illness isn't who she is. Even if she's verbally saying things that are so painful, Mary, like, I hate you, I can't stand you, get away from me. The biggest blessing that I'm learning for myself and that I'm trying to learn with other people is we must separate the brokenness from the person. We have to learn to separate the brokenness from the person. So when you see your daughter, don't call her by what you physically see. Call her by who you hope she will be. I'm going to skip around in my timeline because I really want to speak to this, Mary. My name is Joyce, and I was named the rejoicing of my father. I was a second daughter. In African culture, you want boys. Boys are your pride and joy. But when I was born, another girl, my father rejoiced. Joy is in my name. It was almost like something prophetic that my parents spoke over me. Even in my sickest, I would call my mom and tell her about my suicidal ideations. Honestly, I would call her and tell her about how I wanted to die, how I felt terrible. And you know what my mom did? She spoke life into me. She never called me by my illness. She called me by my wellness. She called me the rejoicing of my Father. She called me joy. She's like, when you enter the room, things change. You are life. You are a diamond. You are meant to withstand great pressure, and you come out shining. You are a fighter. You are a survivor. Meanwhile, my dishes were piled up. I was barely cleaning my house. If I was able to get out of the bed and take a shower for the day when I was sick, it was an accomplishment. But my mother never addressed me in my brokenness. She addressed me in my wellness. And we're going to talk about the power of our words and the power of understanding identity. So I'm so sorry, Mary, that this is what your daughter is going through. And she's self-isolating, self-medicating, it sounds like, and just pushing you away. You are allowed to say that this hurts. You're allowed to say that this sucks. But what I really encourage you to practice, because it is a practice speaking life into her. And when she is being hurtful, practice not seeing her as she is, but seeing her in a place of wellness. That's another way of looking at it in terms of faith. You don't call things that they are, you call things as they hope to be. But we're going to get more into that in this space and in this show. Continue to share as you're willing experiences, general questions about how to relate to family members. I'm going to have an entire segment on this. Ursuline, hi, my dear. Let us know where you're watching in from. Thank you so much for being here. It's so good to have you. We're just going through my story. I believe that there's power in our stories and how I came to a place of wellness. So after being diagnosed in law school, I rejected the diagnosis for a little bit. But then, oddly enough, there was something so satisfying about finally being able to point to it, finally being able to say, I'm not just a moody, sad person. There is something happening in my brain that is causing me to show up in the world like this. Like, as much as it sounds ironic or oxymoronic, when I was diagnosed with the illness, I felt freer because at least I could point to something. And in a bit, we're going to talk about the power of naming things. Yes, separate the brokenness from the person. It doesn't mean that people are not held accountable for their actions or their behaviors. Accountability is a part of growth, maturity, and healing. But it does mean that we don't forget that with mental illness, it's also a form of sickness. And when we can separate the brokenness from the person, it helps us to be more compassionate, more patient, and it actually helps the person in their journey of healing. And it helps you if you're called to be with them in that journey, because it allows you to give them grace. And we can all use a lot of grace. So back to the denial, then the acceptance. Now comes the conversation with my mom about, hey, I've been diagnosed with anxiety disorder and major depression. And the first thing my Black mama said was, do not tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Don't go to a therapist. Do not take medication. Don't do any of that. And don't put on your application, because if you do, no one's going to hire you. Go to church and pray, pray, pray. That's what she said. And if I were well, I probably would have been more patient and understanding. But first of all, even as a Black woman, to admit that you have experiencing a mental illness, that was one, very embarrassing. Women are already told that they're hyper emotional. So to be diagnosed as emotional, is embarrassing. But then when you're trying to work through it, you have family members telling you to deny it. But let me tell you something else. You cannot address what you don't confront. You cannot address what you don't confront. Had I never called it for what it is, I never would have been able to be freed from it, because living in denial doesn't make the illness goes away. If you have a tumor and you act like it's not there, does it mean it's not there? No. If you are having high blood pressure and you ignore it, does it mean it's not there? No. But there's a balance for those who are faith-based. I identify as Christian. There is a balance, and that balance does not include totally ignoring things. And I want to get into a little bit more of that, but Mary, I see you talking about how you don't tell her how much you love her and how much Jesus loves her. Oh, so you guys are long distance. You said that you live in New Jersey and she lives in North Carolina. I love me a Jersey girl, so hey. But she looks like she's more south. Yeah. Speaking to me sometimes. Yeah. I can't imagine what it feels like to be struggling with someone that you love for so far away. I'm so sorry that that's your experience, but you did mention Jesus, and I gotta say this. Fear and faith cannot coexist. It is totally normal to be worried. You are her mother. That's a normal human response. You cannot live in fear and you cannot live in worry, right? So every time, and I'm jumping ahead of myself on the agenda, but this is going to be one of the practical tips. You must meet fear with faith. And for those of you who aren't religious, this is a truth principle. It is just the truth. Fear and positivity, however you want to coin it, cannot coexist. Light and darkness cannot coexist. You cannot be hopeful for something and simultaneously be fearful. You have to choose one because one overpowers the other, right? So later on, very soon actually, because we're almost at time, I'm going to talk about how to speak to that fear in order to reprogram your mind, your thinking, and how you process situations. But I'm so grateful that you raised that, Mary. So confronting healing by addressing it was pivotal to me. And let me tell you something else. We're going to talk about mental health and the church, capital C church, because I can honestly say, I don't think that the capital C church has done enough to really address this issue of mental illness, especially in the Black community. Guess what? Prayer is powerful and prayer changes things. But guess what? God made doctors. God made therapists. God made psychology. God gave people the ability, neuroscience, to study the brain and how it works, to study the brain and how it's connected to the gut and how what we eat affects our minds. God made medication. God made all of these things. So let's talk really briefly about my trials and treatment. So I personally was adamant about finding a Black therapist. I am not saying that if you're a Black person, you must go to a Black therapist. There were just some things. I was so sick, so sick. There are some things I didn't want to have to explain to someone who didn't look like me. That's just period. I didn't want to have to explain how going into an all-white office isn't helping my mental health. Going into certain spaces isn't helping me. So for me personally, a Black therapist was helpful. But also a lie that I want to call out and address is that I was told generally that with medication, when it comes to anxiety and depression specifically, you'll never be cured. It only numbs you or it helps you cope. So a lot of medications do different things. They may up the serotonin and dopamine levels in your brain. They may numb the levels of anxiety so that you're able to better navigate the world if you're anxious. But there is no medical cure for anxiety and depression. So I was told generally that I will always have to experience these things. And if it got worse, I can take higher doses, but there is no cure medically for it. That didn't sit well with my spirit. And it didn't sit well with my spirit because my spirit knew that I'm called and created for a life of abundance and healing. And it's either I'm free, period, or I'm not. But if God calls me free, then what is this that I will always be sick? That doesn't make sense. If God says I'm free, then how am I remaining in sickness? If God says I'm free, then how am I going to take medications that are just going to help me cope, but not overcome? Am I anti-medication? Absolutely not. Listen, I took medication for like 3 months. I just could never get the doses right. I don't even really take Tylenol, so it just wasn't for me personally. Always consult with a healthcare provider because I know so many powerful Christians that are on this journey of wellness that take medication to cope. There is no shame or condemnation or judgment. Don't judge yourself and don't judge others. The reason I rejected medication after trying it is one, it didn't work for me. And two, I didn't want to be using a drug that wouldn't cure me. It would only help me cope. I wanted to find a more long-lasting, permanent solution to what I was experiencing. And that's why I pivoted from medication to something better. And I'm going to get to that something better in 2 weeks for part 2 of this show. I was hoping to cover it all today, but there are some practical things that I want to get to, and I think it's important not to rush that. So if you are curious, you heard the backstory, you heard how I was diagnosed, how I was like a weird emo goth kid, and how it was functioning in law school and coming out with sickness to my family. Stay tuned for in 2 weeks, I believe, for what it looked like for me to come to a place of wellness. Now, this space is not just monologues. Like I said, it's a conversation. I will be having people on the show, but let's talk about what you can expect for this space as friends. So we are going to talk about mental health in the Black community. Why was it stigmatized? Is it still stigmatized? How we overcome it? We're going to talk about how food affects your mental health. We're going into the holiday season. Again, I don't really know how I feel about counting calories, but I do believe that the way that you get to a place of mental illness is by what you feed yourself. But look, God created butter, God created oil, God created so many good, yummy things that we're able to use in moderation. But what if I told you that what you eat can also feed your mind and your mental wellness? How about dating and mental illness? If you're a depressed, anxious girl, you have some other kind of medical diagnosis, how do you come out with that? How do you date with that? I dated for a long time before I got married, so we'll talk about that. Talk about how to talk to your family about mental illness. If there's a loved one that has it. And there's so much more that I'd love to dive into, but let's get into some practical tips. I want you guys to practice if you're experiencing it or if a loved one is experiencing mental health issues. First, listen. Do not numb yourself to what is happening. Listen to whatever lie or whatever negative narrative is what I call them, negative story that you're telling yourself throughout the day. I used to tell myself, I'm always going to be this way. I'm a sad girl. I'm an anxious girl. I'll always be this way. Instead of running from those negative narratives, listen to them because you cannot address what you do not confront and you cannot change what you do not name. Name those negative narratives, name those lies. So after listening, speak. Speak the truth to those lies. When I would tell myself I'm a sad girl and I was pivoting to wellness, I would think of my mother's words and be like, you're the rejoicing of your father. You are joy personified. You are light. You bring life and light to every room because of God in you. So every time a lie would come, I would listen and then I would speak to it about the truth about who I am and who I was designed to be. And the last one, rinse and repeat. It took years for some of us to get to this place of negative narratives in our brain. It will not take years to deconstruct, but it will take time. Repeat it. It's okay if these lies come and you meet it with the truth and you're doing a great job and the next day the lies are back. It doesn't mean you're broken, my dear. It means that you're healing. And healing is a practice. So listen for what the narrative is so that you can name it. Speak the truth to that narrative and then repeat it. Repeat it as often as you need to. Repeat the truth out loud. Write it down. Tell your friends. Put it on post-it notes. And I promise you, that is the beginning of the journey to changing the narrative and taking control of your mental wellness and living in abundance. Okay, my friends, thank you all for joining in this space. Stay tuned on December 6th for part 2. And I'm so happy to have you here with me. Come thrive with me. Have a great Thanksgiving and we'll talk so soon.